freedom doesn't come for free. The democracy and the liberties and the prosperity that we take for granted now will actually have to be defended, and people will have to stand up and do so.
But now, who will defend Europe? That's the question being asked by the Russia and defence expert Keir Giles in his new book of the same name. For decades, European countries, including Britain, ran down their armed forces, banking on the so-called peace dividend from the end of the Cold War, plus security from the US and NATO as a whole. But with the US politically unsettled and the Kremlin on manoeuvres, Europe has been scrambling to rebuild its defences. Yesterday, at a meeting in Berlin, President Joe Biden called for sustained support for Ukraine, saying, "I know the cost is heavy, but make no mistake, it pales in comparison to the cost of living in the world where aggression prevails." So can Europe defend itself if Russia attacks beyond Ukraine? Can Europe rely on NATO? And what changes if Donald Trump returns to the White House? Who Will Defend Europe is published on Thursday. The author Keir Giles has advised many governments on the threat of Russia. He's also a senior fellow with Chatham House's Russia and Eurasia programme and the director of Conflict Studies Research Centre. And he joins me now. Keir, welcome back to Times Radio.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for being here. Keir, before we get into the issue of Europe's defences, should we start with whether you believe that Russia is intent on attacking beyond Ukraine?
Sadly, it does seem that way. Now, a lot of people will have seen just in the last week Germany's intelligence chiefs explaining how they have arrived at that conclusion that Russia has set its sights on further countries beyond Ukraine. But of course, that isn't news. And that's one of the reasons why in the time since that became clear, I've had the time and job write a whole book about it and have it published. So this is several months and several years in the brewing. Now, of course, a lot of people will say, how is this even possible? How can Russia actually move beyond Ukraine when it seems to have been fought to a standstill in Ukraine itself? But the problem is Russia has been rebuilding and reconstituting its armed forces faster than Ukraine can actually destroy them. And the intent behind them seems to be unchanged.
Now, the argument has been made many times by people, including President Zelensky himself, that it is the resistance of Ukraine that's defending Europe. Do you believe that to be true?
Well, that is undisputably true. That is precisely what has kept Russia from moving further already. Now, the question of the book is, of course, who will defend Europe? And the dedication right in the very beginning is to the people of Ukraine who have been defending Europe, who have been the front line for more than a decade now. But, of course, that is open to question as to whether the support from the West is actually going to be sufficient to keep Ukraine in the fight, and for how long. And of course, if there is any form of end to the combat in Ukraine, if there is a ceasefire, a negotiated settlement, whatever you call it, that frees up Russia's energies and also means it can rebuild its armed forces faster, that means that the challenge for the rest of Europe is even sooner.
If Putin's military ambition, if he can't defeat Ukraine, I mean, does that stop Putin? You know, I mean, will a loss in Ukraine mean that his military ambition is at an end?
That depends entirely how severe that loss is. Now, this too is not a new issue. It's been recognized for a long time that the only thing that will challenge Russia's ambitions to expand its territory, to expand its control, to threaten the West is actually a severe strategic defeat that makes Russia stop and think. And they simply haven't had that yet. But the problem is the opportunities for Ukraine to deliver that defeat have been missed time and again. And so we're into this extended conflict where it seems the policy of the United States is, rather than to defeat Russia, is to bleed it slowly. And of course, the tragedy of that is it bleeds slowly Ukraine as well and comes at the cost of innocent civilians.
So what needs to happen for that to change? What needs to happen for Ukraine to actually decisively defeat Russia?
Well, we could go on a long list of missed opportunities, but primarily it's a question of attitude from the Western powers in this coalition that are backing Ukraine. For so long, the United States was terrified of so-called escalation. It did not want to inflict too much damage on Russia for fear of what might happen as a result. Now, of course, we have the additional challenge that the US has other problems around the world to deal with. It's distracted, its resources will be pulled away by China, by what's happening in the Middle East, and it's demonstrated clearly that protecting Israel is a higher priority than protecting Europe. With all of this, the opportunities for actually making sure that Ukraine can withstand Russia are few and far between. And that means the priority now has to be for the countries beyond Ukraine to look to their defenses. And you mentioned in your intro there that Europe is scrambling to rebuild those defenses. Sadly, it's not the whole of Europe. The frontline states recognize the challenge, and that's why they are pouring funds into being ready for what is coming down the track. But other countries, like this one, are not doing so.
So what would we need to do to rearm as effectively as you think we need to?
There is a long shopping list of deficiencies in the British armed forces and those of its European neighbours. Some of them are actually being put right by budget increases in, for example, France, in Norway, in the frontline states. But for the time being here in the UK, we have instead a strategic defence review, which is pushing the questions down the track. Now, of course, it's important to figure out precisely what the threats are, but also it adds delay to decisions to put right those things that are recognisably challenges to the capability of the armed forces by at least a year. And even then, it's been stated that there will not be the kind of uplift in budget, the kind of transformative investment in defence that we've seen from those countries that see the threat as being more immediate.
Which countries should we look to who are doing it better?
Well, that comes down to the question that's answered in the book. I hold up two examples of countries that are preparing to either deter Russia or, if deterrence fails, to actually withstand a Russian onslaught. And those two countries are Poland and Finland. Poland, because it has undertaken that kind of transformative reinvestment in defense. Rather than 2% of GDP, the NATO threshold, it's actually spending 4, getting on for 5 now, because it recognizes how urgent this is. And also Finland, protecting its civilians, protecting its infrastructure, its society against the consequences of war by having a total civil defense plan, as opposed to the UK, which apparently has no civil defense plan at all. So civilians are left unprotected in the event of conflict.
Keir, there was very strong reaction earlier this summer to the Conservatives' mooted policy to reintroduce national service. Would that sort of thing help, do you think?
I think calling it national service was an unfortunate choice of describing what this concept was, because, of course, it calls to mind conscription back in the 1950s, which was not the idea behind what was being proposed. Instead, it's more of a broader recognition that as a result of what is coming to Europe, as a result of the threat that is looming, lives here will have to change. And as has been stated far more bluntly in the frontline states, freedom doesn't come for free. The democracy and the liberties and the prosperity that we take for granted now will actually have to be defended, and people will have to stand up and do so. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean issuing a rifle to everybody and expecting them to defend against invaders. Instead, it's a recognition that some kind of contribution to society to actually keep it afloat is essential when you're under that kind of challenge.
We spoke about sort of funding from the US. I mean, do you think Europe can rely on continued US military backing? And what might change if Donald Trump does become president again in November?
Well, if Donald Trump becomes president and does half of what he has threatened to do, then it is not only Ukraine that is in immediate severe difficulties, but it's the whole of Europe as well. We've seen the immediate consequences of interruptions of US aid to Ukraine, excuse me, earlier on this year, when Congress stepping on the hose that was delivering aid to Ukraine led directly to lives and territory lost. And we could expect the same as more or less as soon as Donald Trump arrives in power. But if also he makes good on his threats to withhold US support for NATO, that removes the whole core of NATO defense capacity. And so it is Europe that would have to stand with a far more limited amount of US involvement than has been taken for granted in defense planning up until now. That just adds an extra layer of urgency for European countries to actually take an interest in being able to defend themselves.
Yeah. I mean, how far would that not necessarily cripple, but hinder NATO if he were to do that?
Well, one of the ways in which the United States has tried to Trump-proof its commitment to NATO is by putting through legislation that says the president can't unilaterally withdraw from NATO. But that, of course, is only a partial measure, because you don't have to withdraw from NATO in order to completely undermine what NATO can actually deliver. You can, for example, simply not issue orders to your own troops to take part in a NATO response. You can not vote for an Article 5 response where NATO meets its treaty obligations to the country that is under attack. In all of these different ways, it is extremely easy to sabotage the process that's been presented by NATO sometimes as being taken for granted, of all NATO countries coming to the aid of a country that's under attack. And if it's the United States that does it, that is the biggest and most important challenge to that whole purpose of NATO.
Okay, this is quite a bleak conversation. Do you feel like the population of Europe as a whole is prepared for this potential new reality as you see it to be?
Well, it's a bleak conversation. It's a bleak book. And one of the most striking things is in the 3 months since I put the finishing touches to it and now it's been ready for publication, things have got much worse, much faster. All of the trends that I was talking about in the book have moved on, and we have bigger challenges now than we did then. And not only the ongoing distraction of the United States, but now the arrival of North Korean troops to take part in the invasion of Europe. It's alarming how fast this is going. As for whether people recognize it, of course, you've always got that gradient of threat perception across Europe. The closer people are to Russia, the more they recognize what a challenge this poses to the way of life that they would like to take for granted. The further away, of course, the more the illusion that distance actually lends security. But as we've seen from this Russian campaign of arson and sabotage and murder plots across Europe, it doesn't actually help being physically distant from Russia. You will still be a target if there is that general warfare.
Keir, thank you so much for your insights and your time this morning. Bleak but important stuff. That's Who Will Defend Europe? An Awakened Russia and a Sleeping Continent by Keir Giles. It's available at thetimesbookshop.co.uk, where Times Plus members can enjoy a 20% discount on that and thousands of other titles.